angiosperms. What is morphology? Morphology is defined as a branch of biology which deals with the study of internal and external features of an organism. So the external morphology. So internal morphology, we also call it as anatomy. So whenever we are talking about morphology, it is the study of external and internal features of an organism. So here, more of external features we are studying in case of these flowering plants. So when we say it as flowering plants, we are talking about angiosperms. So you should remember about it. So in the morphology of flowering plants, we'll be studying this external morphology as well as internal morphology. Internal morphology, we call it as anatomy. So that we'll be studying after this completion of this morphology of flowering plants. Okay. So you can see this particular backdrop slide, what you can notice is, so we have this flower. Uh, you look at it as a individual flower, isn't it? You say, think that it's an individual flower. It is not an individual flower. It is a collection of many flowers. So you find this petal-like structures. Each of this petal-like structure is a floret. Small flower, we call it as florets, Florets. So each and every petal is a flower. It's a floret. Okay, we call it as ray florets. The petal-like structures, what you see are ray florets. And on the disc, you find numerous small flowers. So you can notice it. I'll just zoom it. So on this disc floret, you can notice this numerous tubular shaped flowers. So we call it as disc florets. So there is a ray floret as well as disc floret. So it's a bouquet of flowers. So even though it looks for a layman, for a person who doesn't have a knowledge of botany, so this looks like a single flower, but it's not a single flower, it's a bouquet of flowers. So we call this sort of flower, which we also see it in sunflower. So we call this as head inflorescence. So that is the backdrop of the picture that we have for this first slide. So you can just remember about that. Okay. So this is the flower that you can remember about. So the Tithonia diversifolia, we call it as. Scientific name is not required for you. Even sunflower has this sort of inflorescence, which we call it as head inflorescence. So you should just remember that part of it. So that's a backdrop flower that we have utilized. So there are variety of flowers and inflorescence that we'll be studying under this topic. So morphology, it is the study of external forms of an organism. Morphology is the study of external features of an organism. So angiosperms, they are also called as flowering plants. You know that they are characterized by the presence of roots, stem, leaves, fruit, flower, and fruits. So an angiosperm or flowering plant is characterized by the roots, stem, leaf, flower, and fruits. So the main parts of flowering plants are root system, which are underground system, and the aerial system, which is above the ground. We call it as the shoot system. The main parts of a flowering plants are the root system, which is underground, and the shoot system, which is above the ground. So under this, we'll be studying about the roots, the first part of it that we study. Before we go into that, you should remember that there was an experiment done by botanists wherein they tied the plant upside down. The roots were facing the uh, upper surface and the leaves were facing downwards. Okay, they had tied it upside down. So after a few days, they noticed that, and they continuously sprayed it with nutrients and water. After a few days, they noticed that the root bends towards the soil, and the stem bent towards against the soil. They started growing towards the source of sunlight. Okay, so the roots were bending towards the soil. So they found this peculiar thing. So from that, they also came to conclusion the root system is positively geotrophic. They grow towards the gravitational force, and negatively phototrophic. That is, they grow away from sunlight. Whereas the shoot system, it is positively phototrophic. They grow towards the sunlight, and negatively geotrophic. That is, they grow against the gravitational force. So this phenomenon is noticed in this root system and shoot system. Root system is positively geotrophic. They grow towards the source of soil. They are positively hydrotrophic. They grow towards the source of water. And they are negatively phototrophic. They grow away from light. Whereas the shoot system is positively phototrophic. They grow towards the source of light, and negatively geotrophic. They grow against the gravitational force. So that features you should always remember about the shoot system and root system. So we'll go into the root system study of it. So you can see a small plant, it has a dense root system. So the section of soil within that, you can notice how the roots have spread. This is in case of a dicotyledonous plants. If you look into monocot plants, they would be fibrous root and they would be helping in holding the soil also. They are good soil binders. The roots of grasses and others, they are good soil binders. So you should remember about that. So whereas in a dicot plant, they go more deeper into the soil. They have this taproot system. So we'll be looking into that and studying these roots part of it. So this is a root system we'll be studying about. So the root, it is the underground part. Root is an underground part formed from the radicle of embryo. See, when the seeds germinate, they produce a radicle which grows towards the soil. And the part of the seed which grows above the soil, we call it as the plumule. So the seeds on germination, they produce the radicle which grows into the soil. So that is later going to form, the radicle is later going to develop to form the roots. You can see that radicle has developed to form the roots. So the cotyledons will provide initial source of food for the developing plant. And then the leaves start developing. Once the leaves are formed and they are able to undergo photosynthesis, the cotyledons, they wither away. So cotyledons initially provide source of nourishment for the germinating seeds. Still the leaves are developed and they can undergo the photosynthesis. So the radicle is going to form the root. So the root is the underground part which is formed from the radicle of the embryo. So you should remember that root is the underground part which is formed from the radicle of the embryo. When the seeds germinate, they produce the radicle which grows into the soil. So this radicle later develops to form the root system. There are three types of root system. They are the taproot system, which you can notice in the dicotyledonous plant, where the radicle develops to form the primary root, and from them they arise the secondary and tertiary roots. In fibrous root system, which you notice in case of grasses, so you notice that initially they'll have this radical, but later they disintegrate and the fibers arise from the base of the stem. So we call this as fibrous root system. Then adventitious root system, if roots are arising from any part other than the radical, we call it as adventitious root system. You can notice in case of banyan tree, the stem produces the aerial roots which reaches the ground and they provide support for this canopy of this banyan tree. So we call it as prop roots. So you can notice prop roots is an example for adventitious root system. So fibrous root system is noticed in case of monocotyledonous plants. So there are three types of root system. The taproot system, in which the radicle develops to form the primary root and they branch to form the secondary and tertiary roots. In fibrous root system is noticed in grasses, monocot plants. Initially, the roots are formed by the radicle, but later the radical uh, disintegrates and the roots arise from the base of the stem and they spread at the surface of the soil. We call this as fibrous root. The taproot goes deep into the soil. The fibrous roots, they are going to spread on the surface and they help in binding the soil also. So adventitious root system, they develop from roots develop from any part other than the radicle. We call it as adventitious root system. So these are the three types of root system. So taproot system, it consists of primary roots or taproot, which is arising from the radicle, and it branches to form secondary roots, tertiary roots. So the taproot system is noticed in case of dicotyledons. Primary root is the elongated form of the elongated from the radicle. So the primary root is formed by the elongation of the radicle. Example is mustard plant. So in mustard plant, you can notice that. So fibrous root system. See, in monocotyledonous plants, primary root is short-lived, that is radical is short-lived and is replaced by a large number of roots. So these roots originate from the base of the stem and they form this fibrous root system. So example, wheat, paddy, all the uh, cereals, they exhibit this fibrous root system. All the monocot plants, they exhibit this fibrous root system. In monocotyledonous plants, the primary root is short-lived and it is replaced by a number of roots. So these roots originate from the base of the stem and they form this fibrous root system. Example, wheat is an example for the fibrous root system. The adventitious root system. So root systems, roots that arise from parts other than the radicle, we call it as adventitious roots. Example, grass, you find the stilt roots, then monstera and banyan tree. See, in banyan tree, you find the roots are arising from the aerial branches. So they provide the mechanical strength. They hold the huge canopy of the tree. The best example to look into the prop roots is you have to visit the big banyan tree. See, the prop roots also looks like the thickness will be similar to that of the main stem of the banyan tree. Okay, so nearly 5 acres of land is occupied by this big banyan tree. So if you can just see the prop root system that has helped them to surround that area. So the prop roots are an example of roots arising from other than radicals. So they are arising from the aerial branches of stem and they reach the ground and they provide support. It is just like pillars. So we call this sort of aerial roots which reaches the ground. We call it as adventitious roots. So prop roots are an example for adventitious roots. Even in case of certain plants like the pandanus and others for mechanical strength, at the base of the stem, you find roots arising from the base of the stem and entering into the soil. They provide mechanical strength for the plants. So the stilt roots are also example for adventitious roots. So the prop roots, stilt roots, they're all examples for adventitious root system. Now, if you look into the regions of the root, so this diagram you should be aware about. So the root tip, where they have this meristem. So the root tip is protected by a root cap. Okay, so the region of meristematic activity, you can know the cells are undergoing continuous division, mitotic cell division. Okay, above that is the region of cell elongation. So in the region of maturation, you can differentiate the cells like epidermis, cortex, endodermis, pericycle, xylem, phloem. So those differentiation you can notice. And also in this region of maturation, you can notice the root hairs. Root hairs absorb the water and moisture. So these are the different regions of the roots. They have a root cap, the region of meristematic activity, region of elongation, region of maturation or differentiation, and root hairs. So these are the different regions or parts of the root. So the root cap, it is covering the apex of the root. So it protects the growing tips of the root. The meristematic apex of the root, it is protected by the root cap. So it protects the tender apex of the root. Root cap is covering the apex of root and it protects the tender apex of the root. See the meristematic activity, region of meristematic activity, it is seen above the root cap. Here the cells are very small, thin walled, and they have dense protoplasm. So they are undifferentiated mass of rapidly dividing cells. That is meristem. So meristem tissue is formed. So meristem tissue can also call it as undifferentiated mass of rapidly dividing cells. So they are undergoing mitotic cell division. So you can notice that in the region of meristematic activity, so they are above the root cap. The cells are very small, thin walled, and dense protoplasm. They divide rapidly. They divide repeatedly. So these are nothing but meristematic tissue. So you can also define meristematic tissue as undifferentiated mass of rapidly dividing cells that you notice in the meristematic zone. So in the region of cell elongation, it is a region above the meristematic region. Here the cell undergoes enlargement and elongation. So they attain the same size as that of the parent cell in the region of elongation. They not only undergo enlargement, but also elongation of the cell takes place. So these region of cell elongation, they help in the growth of the root in length. So the growth of the root in length is brought about by the at the region of elongation. Then the third region is region of maturation. So the region above or proximal to elongation zone is the region of maturation or differentiation. Here the cells differentiate and mature. So you can notice here the parenchyma cells, the epidermal cells, endodermis, pericycle, pith. Then you can also notice this xylem and phloem. But in the region of elongation and region of meristematic activity, you don't find this differentiation. They are just undifferentiated mass of cells, you notice them. Okay, that differentiation into epidermis, parenchyma, the endodermis, pericycle, pith, xylem, and phloem. It takes place in this region of differentiation. That is why we call it as the cells differentiate and mature in this region of maturation. Root hairs, they are very fine, delicate thread-like structures which are formed from the epidermal cells. The single epidermal cell gives rise to this root hairs. They are unicellular root hairs. So with the epidermal cells gives rise to the fine, delicate thread-like structures called as the root hairs. So they absorb water and minerals from the soil. The root hairs absorb water and minerals from the soil. That is the uh, various activity of root that you should remember. Now the modifications of root, if you look into, so some of the roots are modified for storage of food. Like you have three types of roots: the conical root, fusiform root, and napiform root. So conical root example is carrot. So they store the food in this root. Okay, so the fusiform root example is the radish. Napiform, beetroot, turnip. So they have a swollen structure which suddenly tapers. So we call it as beetroot, turnip. They are all example for the napiform roots. So in some plants, the roots are modified to perform functions other than absorption and conduction. See, the major function of root is they provide anchorage to the plants. They absorb minerals and waters from the soil. So they are the main function. And they also help in conduction of water and minerals. Now, there are other functions apart from this anchorage, absorption, and conduction, like the roots might be swollen ಊದ್ಕೊಂಡಿರತ್ತೆ for storage of food. So even in carrot, they would have stored the food. In case of sweet potato, they would have stored the food. So you notice those. In radish, they would have stored the food. So you find swollen roots for storage of food. Then you find prop roots, the aerial roots, which are coming from the branches of banyan tree. So they provide mechanical strength. Okay, so the aerial roots arise from the branches of the banyan tree and they grow into the soil. They provide support just like pillar to the huge canopy of banyan tree. Stilt roots, again, they provide mechanical strength, and you can notice them in case of pandanus plants. And even in maize plants, you can notice this stilt roots. Then there are pneumatophores in marshy soil. Okay, the amount of water and the amount of soil are equal. So the oxygen level in these marshy soil are very less because it is difficult for the oxygen to diffuse into such marshy soil, which has equal amount of water and soil. So as a result of that, the mangrove vegetation, the plants, they have negatively geotrophic roots. They arise above the ground, and these roots have numerous pores on them. So we also call these roots as respiratory roots or pneumatophores. They help in taking up the oxygen from the atmosphere, and thus the requirement of oxygen in case of roots are fulfilled by this respiratory roots or pneumatophores. So root, they not only have the function of anchorage, providing anchorage, absorption of water and minerals, and conduction of water and minerals, but they also can store food. They also can provide mechanical strength, as in case of prop roots and stilt roots, and they can absorb oxygen from the atmosphere through this pneumatophores, which are seen in this mangrove vegetation. So the swollen roots for food storage. So you can see this carrot would have stored the food. So we usually call this as conical root. Then even in case of sweet potato, you find that they would have stored the food. So the adventitious roots of sweet potato, seed soup, you notice that they would have stored the food. So you might ask me, sir, why do you call sweet potato a root, but you say potato as a stem? See, these any structure to be called as root or stem, they should have certain definition of it. See, the roots have root hairs. Potato has root hairs. Carrot has root hairs. Turnip has root hairs. But in case of potato, sweet potato has root hairs, but in case of potato, they don't have root hairs. They instead have the eye of the potato, or buds we call it as. So from which the nodes we call it as, from which the buds arise. So eye of the potato we call it as. So there are stem has this nodes and internodes which are not found in roots. Roots have the root hairs. That is how we identify what type of modified structure is it, whether it is underground stem modification or underground root modification. So root modifications, they have the root hairs. Underground stem modifications, they have nodes and internodes, especially in potato, the nodal region from which the bud arise, we call it as the eye of the potato. So you should remember that. So swollen roots for food storage, tap roots of carrot, the turnip, adventitious roots of sweet potato, they are storing the food. So this is an example for prop roots, the hanging roots from the uh, stem of the banyan tree. So you can see these hanging structures which support the huge canopy of this banyan tree. So you should visit the big banyan tree to just appreciate the prop roots and the mechanical strength that they provide, support that they provide for this huge canopy of banyan tree. Then there are stilt roots, you find it in maize, okay, jola. So you might find it in case of maize. So they provide mechanical strength to the plants. Even in sugarcane, you can find this supporting roots coming out from the lower node of the stems. So we call it as stilt roots. You can notice it in sugarcane and maize. Okay, sugarcane is the sweetest grass. So maize also, they would be showing you this stilt roots. Pandanus also has stilt roots. So the pneumatophores, the roots that come out of the ground and they grow vertically upwards to get oxygen from respiration. So this respiratory roots, they have numerous pores on them. So we call them, these respiratory roots also as pneumatophores. Example is the rhizophoria, which are growing in swampy areas. Okay, marshy places, they have this uh, the roots which absorb oxygen from the atmosphere. Okay, so through their numerous pores that are present through their uh, the negatively geotrophic roots, that is the pneumatophores. So what are the functions of the root? They absorb water and minerals from the soil. So the roots, they absorb water and minerals from the soil. They provide proper anchorage to the plants. They store reserve food material. So they are also utilized in the synthesis of plant growth regulators. You can see here different types of root system which are involved in absorption of water and minerals. They provide a proper anchorage to the plant parts, storage of reserve food materials. They also help in the synthesis of plant growth regulators. So that is what you have to remember regarding this uh, root system part of it. Okay.